Hello again, I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org, and I'm back this time with a quick review of the new Tamron 17-70 f2.8 VC, which may very well be the most perfect general-purpose lens on the market right now for Sony's APS-C cameras. This video is going to be a little quicker than usual, and it's not a comparison video like most of my previous videos have been. It'll focus on the Tamron lens, but I will also compare it with the very common Sony 16-50mm f3.5 to 5.6 kit lens, and let me get this out of the way now. This is not a fair comparison. We're looking at an $800 Tamron lens and a Sony lens that costs $150 at most. But I find that a lot of people who use the kit lens don't know how big a difference there really is between it and a more professional option, and that's what I'm trying to show here. As you can see, the Tamron lens is significantly larger than the Sony. It weighs 553 grams, but it's still a relatively lightweight lens for what it is. It's almost the same size as the Tamron 28-75mm f2.8, but it has nearly the same zoom range as that lens plus the 17-28, and the 17-70 has image stabilization, which neither of those other two have. The Tamron 17-70 has weather sealing, and it shares the same 67mm filter threads as all of the other Tamron lenses for Sony E-mount. Needless to say, it's much larger than the Sony 16-50. The Tamron is about 4 times as long and more than 4 times as heavy. Now, I usually spend a fair amount of time comparing the resolution of the lenses at a variety of different apertures and parts of the frame. This time, I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of examples, for reasons that will soon be obvious. Starting with both of these lenses zoomed to about 50mm, I shot these images of the city on the Sony a6300, and with both of the lenses at f5.6, since that's the widest aperture available on the Sony lens. Here's the center of the image, where both lenses are at their best. Here, the Tamron is obviously sharper, and while the Sony isn't really terrible, it is soft, with a bit of a foggy look. But when we move away from the center of the frame, the Tamron looks awesome, and the Sony is a complete mess. Now, this is probably partially because of a flaw in the Sony lens. If we look at the other edge of the frame, the Sony is still bad, but it's not as bad. But that's actually one of the drawbacks of using a cheap kit lens. The quality control generally isn't as good as more expensive optics, so out-of-alignment elements like this are not uncommon. If we look at the lenses at the wide end of their zoom ranges, with the Tamron at f2.8 and the Sony as wide as it will go at f3.5, again, the Tamron is just sharper here in the center. And the further you move away from the center, on both sides of the image, the Sony just gets worse. In fact, if I leave the Tamron open at f2.8, but stop down the Sony to f8, you can see that the Sony has improved dramatically, to the point that it looks almost respectable. But it's not as sharp as the Tamron at f2.8, and this is true across the frame. I'll zoom in to 200% here for those of you who need it. So that should give you an idea of how much sharper the Tamron lens is compared to something like a kit lens. And even in absolute terms, the Tamron is a really sharp lens. If you're interested in seeing how the Tamron's resolution compares to some better lenses, I'm adding those examples to the full review on my website, so just follow the link below. As long as I'm talking about image quality, I should mention that I'm using an early release lens, and there are still no lens profiles for it in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, and I've mostly been shooting RAW. The lens has some strong barrel distortion at 17mm, which quickly disappears around 24mm and changes to modest pincushion by 35mm, and strong pincushion at 50 and 70mm. Luckily, when I shoot JPEG, the in-camera correction fixes it without too much trouble, so I expect the same from RAW processors in the near future. But the more important advantage of the Tamron over the Sony kit lens comes with low light performance, and that's for two reasons. The Tamron's large aperture that lets you shoot action in low light, combined with its image stabilization, which lets you shoot clear images in hardly any light. Let me show you what I mean with some photos that I took on a drive out to the Washington coast last week to photograph the lighthouses near Cape Disappointment. I shot all of these with the Tamron 17-70. If it wasn't for Cape Disappointment, I wouldn't have any appointments. I arrived in the late afternoon and started scoping out my shots and playing around with the zoom range. It was a rare sunny day, so I started off at the North Head Lighthouse and then checked out Cape Disappointment just as the sun was starting to get nice and golden. Here, I was able to shoot at a 750th of a second at f4 to stop the motion of the waves. If I'd had to use f5.6, then the shutter speed would have been a 350th of a second, and I probably wouldn't have been able to stop these breaking waves. I drove back to North Head, trying to catch the last rays of the sun on the lighthouse, but I just missed it. Instead, though, I got the nice warm glow of the sunset. This was shot handheld at a 20th of a second at f2.8, ISO 640, and it's still tack sharp because of this lens's image stabilization. Without stabilization, I'd have needed a tripod, or I'd have had to raise the ISO at least up to 1600, at which point the images get noticeably grainy. As the sun continued setting, I roamed around the lighthouse looking for interesting angles, and it kept getting darker and darker. But I still had no trouble shooting handheld, and my ISO never went above 800. Many of these shots would have been better if I'd shot from a tripod and stopped down to f5.6 or 8, but the fact that I didn't have to use a tripod to get something acceptable is one of the things that makes lenses like this Tamron so powerful. Finally, as I walked back to my car, I took this shot of the caretaker's house at an 1/8 of a second at f2.8, and even in that light, at that shutter speed, it's pretty sharp. You can even see some stars in the sky. Now, as I said, most of that could have been done with a tripod, a bit of patience, and any old lens. But if you want to shoot action in low light, whether you're in a dark high school gym or a professional arena, you almost always need a large aperture lens. Unfortunately, there are still no team sports being played around here right now, so I haven't tested the Tamron 17-70. But when there aren't any pandemics going on, I shoot basketball pretty much year-round with manual exposure, and I'd say that the most common exposure that I use is a 1,000th of a second f2.8 at ISO 6400, which is fine if you have a lens like this Tamron that has f2.8 available. But if you're using something like a kit lens that only has f5.6 available, then things look pretty bleak. From f2.8 to 5.6 is 2 full f-stops, and each one cuts the amount of light to your sensor in half. So to make up for it, you have to leave your shutter open twice as long for each one. So your 1/1000th of a second becomes a 500th, and then a 250th. And a 250th just isn't going to stop any sort of fast action reliably. The other alternative, of course, is to boost your ISO. And if you're already at 6400, that means cranking it past 12,800 up to 25,600, which will become a noisy, grainy mess. That situation might seem a little specific, but it's amazing how often you run into it. You will with most indoor and nighttime sports, with dance or theater or music concerts, and of course, events like weddings. So that low light performance can really help you out, but that's not the only advantage of having large aperture. It can also be nice to use when you're shooting portraits, because a larger aperture will help smooth out distracting backgrounds. Here's a portrait shot at 50mm and f5.6 on the Sony, and here's the same shot with the Tamron at f2.8. Notice how much smoother the background is on the Tamron here. The overall impression is much more like a true portrait than a snapshot. And here's another, shooting into the sunlight. The bokeh on the Tamron is again much smoother than the little kit lens, which produces unusual crescent and ring-shaped highlights, while the same highlights on the Tamron are a little larger and somewhat smoother, but also show some onion rings and contrasty edges. The Tamron 17-70 f2.8 is the only lens currently on the market that covers this type of zoom range at f2.8 and has image stabilization, which makes a dramatic difference in producing usable photos in low light, but also in helping to produce some interesting slow shutter speed motion effects without using a tripod. The only real competitor on the market right now is the Sony 16-55 f2.8, which I also really like, but it doesn't have image stabilization built in. It's also significantly more expensive than the Tamron lens. So with the wide angle to mid-telephoto zoom range, the really excellent optical quality throughout the zoom range, a wide f2.8 aperture to let in lots of light, and image stabilization to catch all of those quiet low light moments, and of course, fast, quiet autofocus, the Tamron 17-70 checks all of the boxes. Is it really a perfect lens? Well, no, of course not. There's no such thing as a perfect lens. Its bokeh may not appeal to everyone's taste, it doesn't have the manual focus switch that I like, or the focus lock button, and of course, it weighs 4 times as much as the little kit lens and it won't easily fit in your pocket. But if I could only have one lens for my Sony a6000 series camera, this Tamron is what I'd choose for travel and everyday photography. I suspect that this lens is going to be very, very popular. And that's it. If you're wondering about that giveaway of the Moment rugged sling bag that I mentioned in my last lens review, I'll be announcing the winner for that in my review of the Tamron 70-300, which should be my next video. It's almost finished. If you want to enter, you can go back and watch my comparison of the Sigma 14-24 f2.8 and the Tamron 17-28 for details. That's still open. See you next time. Stay safe out there, everyone.